She was 20 years old. She had just walked home from a shift at McDonald's, the same short walk she made most days, through the same downtown Portland blocks she knew by heart. On the afternoon of July 24, 1979, she stepped into the apartment she shared with her sister and the young man she planned to marry. And within the span of a single quiet afternoon, she was gone. That is not a story about a city that forgot one of its own. That is a story about a killer who passed through a place he had no reason to be, left almost nothing behind, and very nearly carried his secret to the grave. And it would take 4 decades, a volunteer cold case unit that refused to let the file gather dust, and a strand of genetic code reaching across the entire country to a small town in Texas, to finally put a name to the man who did it. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that summer. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Anna Marie Hlavka was. In the summer of 1979, downtown Portland still moved at a human pace. This was a city of corner diners and walk-up apartments, of rotary phones bolted to kitchen walls and clock radios that hummed on the nightstand. Disco was fading on the AM dial, and the long shadow of the 70s hung over everything. A decade when a young woman could still walk home alone from an evening shift and think nothing of it. Anna Marie was part of that world. She was 20, with the whole unwritten length of her life still in front of her, and she had built something small and good for herself in the heart of the city. She worked at a McDonald's a short distance from her building, the kind of job that filled the days while bigger plans took shape. And bigger plans were taking shape. She shared an apartment on Northwest Couch Street with her sister and with the young man she loved, the man she had begun, in that tender and ordinary way, to talk about marrying. They were planning a wedding. They were planning a life. The apartment was modest and full of the cluttered warmth of people just starting out, the radio cord trailing across the nightstand, the small machinery of a normal existence. Anna Marie was the kind of presence a family organizes itself around, the daughter and sister whose absence would leave a shape in the air for decades. She was loved completely and without complication. On that July afternoon, she came home from work around 5 o'clock, the way she always did. That was the last time she was seen alive. What happened next happened fast, and it happened inside the walls of a place that was supposed to be safe. Anna Marie returned to the Couch Street apartment in the early evening. The building was familiar. The street was familiar. Everything about the moment was ordinary, right up until it wasn't. Sometime after she stepped through her own front door, a man was inside that apartment with her. She was attacked. She was strangled with a cord pulled from the clock radio beside the bed, an object so domestic, so unremarkable, that its use as a weapon makes the whole scene harder to bear. There was no forced theatrical struggle that the neighbors would remember, no scream that froze the building. There was only a young woman, alone in the place she trusted most, in the last minutes of her life. When her sister came home, she found her. Imagine that. Imagine walking into your own apartment, calling a name you have called 10,000 times, and finding the answer in a silence that will never end. The police came. The neighbors gathered on the sidewalk in the long summer dusk, and the questions began. The questions that would outlive nearly everyone who first asked them. Who had been in that apartment? How had he gotten in? Why her? By nightfall, Portland had a homicide and almost nothing else. No witness had seen the man come or go. No one in Anna Marie's life had a reason to want her dead. The crime had the worst quality a crime can have for the people left behind. It made no sense. The investigation that followed was thorough, and for a long while it was thoroughly fruitless. Detectives did what detectives did in 1979. They canvassed the building and the block. They looked hard at the people closest to her, because that is where these cases so often end, and one by one they cleared them. The fiancé, the acquaintances, the names that surface whenever a young woman is killed. Each lead was pulled and followed, and, in time, set down again. The trouble was structural, and no amount of effort in 1979 could overcome it. The man who killed Anna Marie Hlafka was, as far as anyone in Portland knew, a stranger. He had no documented connection to her, no grievance, no history with the family that a detective could trace. He had, it would later turn out, no real reason to be in Oregon at all. In an era before the tools that would eventually crack the case even existed, a stranger who left no witnesses was very close to unfindable. The detectives kept the file. They followed what there was to follow. And slowly, the way these things go, the case cooled. Other crimes demanded the city's attention. The detectives who worked it moved on, retired, aged out of the job, but the file did not disappear. And that detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. Somewhere in the Bureau's records, Anna Marie's case sat waiting, because in Portland there were people who did not believe a closed-out year meant a closed case. Years passed, and then more years, and the kind of time went by that changes everything except the grief. The wedding that had been in the planning never happened. The sister who found her carried that evening into the rest of her life. Anna Marie would have turned 30, then 40, the milestones arriving like silent anniversaries for a life that stopped at 20. The world she had lived in slipped into the past. The rotary phones disappeared. The downtown she knew was remade. An entire generation of police officers came and went. And still, no one could say who had walked into that apartment on Couch Street. But the case had not been abandoned. In Portland, a corps of volunteer cold case investigators, many of them retired detectives who simply could not let the unsolved ones rest, kept returning to the old files. In 1999, those volunteers pulled the evidence from Anna Marie's killing and sent it to the Oregon State Police Crime Lab, hoping the science had finally caught up to the crime. It had partway. By 2011, more than 3 decades after her death, technicians recovered a full DNA profile of an unknown man from the evidence, lifted in part from fingernail scrapings. For the first time, there was something concrete, a genetic fingerprint of the killer. They ran it against the offender databases that police rely on, and it matched nothing. The profile of the man who killed her sat in the system, complete and useless, because the one person it belonged to was nowhere in any database it could be checked against. If you have followed this case to here, you understand the particular cruelty of that moment. They had him. They had the very code of him. And they still could not say his name. That is where the case waited for the technology that would change everything. The break, when it finally came from a different direction entirely. In April of 2018, investigators across the country watched a decades-old California case crack wide open when detectives used a new method to identify the man believed to be the Golden State Killer. The technique was called investigative genetic genealogy. Instead of matching crime scene DNA only against convicted offenders, investigators could now compare it against the vast and growing pools of DNA that ordinary people had voluntarily uploaded to public ancestry databases. The same databases hobbyists use to find long-lost cousins and fill in family trees. A killer who had never been arrested, never swabbed, never entered into any law enforcement system, could now be found through the DNA of his relatives. People who had spit into a tube out of simple curiosity about their heritage had, without knowing it, built a map that led straight back toward him. Inspired by what happened in California, the Portland cold case detectives took the unknown man's profile from Anna Marie's case and turned to a company called Parabon Nano Labs, whose genetic genealogists specialized in exactly this kind of search. Working from the crime scene DNA, the genealogist began building a family tree in reverse, mapping the killer's relatives line by line, narrowing the branches. 3 of the 4 major familial lines came together and pointed, impossibly, at one man. He was not from Oregon. He had no obvious tie to Portland at all. His name was Jerry Walter McFadden, and he was from Texas. Once the genealogy named him, the rest of the picture filled in with a terrible clarity. McFadden was no phantom. He was a serial rapist and killer with a long and violent record in Texas, a man who called himself Animal. The court history laid out a chilling timeline. He had been sentenced in 1973 to 15 years for rape, and then paroled in December of 1978, just 8 months before Anna Marie was killed. Investigators confirmed what the genealogy had implied. McFadden had traveled to the Pacific Northwest in 1979, brought there by an acquaintance from his hometown. She told detectives she had dropped him off in Portland and never had contact with him again. That was the connection no detective in 1979 could ever have guessed. There was no reason on earth to suspect that a paroled rapist from East Texas had drifted through downtown Portland in the summer of Anna Marie's death. He was a stranger in the truest and most dangerous sense. A man whose path crossed hers for what may have been a matter of hours, leaving a city to chase a ghost for 40 years. And there was a final, jarring turn. McFadden could never be arrested for what he did on Couch Street, because McFadden was already dead. After his return to Texas, he went on to be convicted of the 1986 rape and murder of an 18-year-old high school student, a crime that triggered what was called the largest manhunt in Texas history. For that, the state of Texas executed him in 1999. Because he died before the era of routine DNA databasing, his genetic profile had never been entered into the national system, which is exactly why his match to Anna Marie's case had come back empty for so many years. To close the loop beyond any doubt, detectives traveled to Texas and met with McFadden's family, who agreed to provide their own DNA. The crime lab compared it to the profile from the Portland apartment. It confirmed what the family tree had revealed. The man who strangled Anna Marie Hlavka in 1979 was Jerry Walter McFadden. In late January of 2019, the Portland Police Bureau stood before the public and said the name aloud. 40 years after a young woman came home from work and never walked out of her apartment again, her case had an answer. There would be no trial, no sentencing, no day in court, because the man responsible had already met his own end 2 decades before. What there was, instead, was something quieter and in its own way just as important. There was the truth. After all the years of not knowing, the family of Anna Marie Hlavka finally knew. The case became known as the first in Oregon to be solved through investigative genetic genealogy, the leading edge of a wave that would go on to resolve dozens, then hundreds, of cases like it across the country, each one built on the same unlikely foundation. The idea that a killer could be found in the DNA of people who simply wanted to know where they came from. Try to hold the whole shape of it in your mind. A young woman in a downtown apartment, planning a wedding, gone in an evening. A stranger from 2,000 miles away who should never have been there. 40 years of silence. And then, out of a database built by curious strangers, a name. It is worth ending where this all began, with her and not with him. Anna Marie Hlavka was 20 years old. She worked an honest job. She loved someone. She was loved in return. And she was looking forward to a life she never got to live. For 40 years, The question of who took that from her hung unanswered. The answer, when it came, could not bring her back. But it could do the one thing her family had waited 4 decades for. It could tell them they had not been wrong to keep believing the truth was findable. How many other cases, sitting in evidence lockers right now, are waiting for the same kind of answer? How many killers, who thought the passage of time had buried them, are about to learn that it never did? And what does it mean that the thing which finally found this man was not a detective's hunch or a deathbed confession, but the quiet, accumulated curiosity of ordinary people mapping their own families? If a story like Anna Marie's stays with you, take a moment to remember her name rather than his. The cases that go cold are not forgotten. Sometimes they are only waiting.